Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. My name is Singh. I'm the Senior Manager of Advocacy and Policy here at the Sikh Coalition, and I'm excited to have everyone here join us for the Summer Series. And thank you again for joining the series on how do you get the attention of policymakers and change policies. Throughout this presentation, we're going to have some interactive questions, so there will be some Zoom polls where we'd love to learn a little bit more and have some of your feedback and make it a little bit interactive. And if you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to chat them. Also, you can raise the hand function. If you want to verbalize your statement and ask your question, we can do that as well. Look forward to learning from all of you and being able to answer and address some of those questions that you may have about engaging policymakers. And when we talk about policymakers, that's a broad term that we're going to be doing to cover elected officials, people who are appointed in positions of power, or those who are generally making decisions about ordinary life for all of us. So again, this is the presentation on how do you get the attention of policymakers and make change. The goals for this presentation is, one, to understand the importance of engaging with policymakers. Secondly, we'll be able to understand better the power structures of government. And then third, what you can do and how to approach and affect change. So to get started, we have an interactive session here on a Zoom poll. The question is, have any of you engaged with policymakers before? And we'll give you about 15, 30 seconds to provide those answers. All right, we're waiting for 2 more people to provide their answers as well. Well, it looks like a lot of you have signed petitions. Some of you have organized and encouraged others to take action. And some of you have also attended a town hall, city or county meeting, or you've emailed or wrote a government official. And that seems to be where most of you have engaged with policymakers. So that's great. I know that some have never participated before, and that's okay. Hopefully we'll be able to change your mind and provide you the right tool set in order to engage those policymakers. Sorry, I'm trying to work the poll here. Okay, so with that in mind, apologize, I'm having technical difficulties. We want to start with discussing what the importance of engaging with policymakers are. Does anyone have any questions before we get started? If so, feel free to chat them or raise your hand and we'll be able to unmute your audio so that you can have the opportunity to ask those questions before we get started. Okay. So today, we're focusing on civic engagement because it's one of the least understood aspects of advocacy. And for those of you that have done it before, we hope you're going to at least learn how to be more strategic in your approaches to become more successful going forward. So with that in mind, how does engaging with policymakers really matter? We just want to emphasize that engaging with policymakers is not just your senators or your congressmen or the president. It also includes school boards, it includes towns, it includes your state elected officials, and your policymakers govern a lot of aspects of our daily lives. That's how we live, how we work, learn, and how we stay safe. Businesses, for example, are often told by townships and counties what specific zoning ordinances will define where, when, and how they can operate a store or deal with competition. Local government policies can also shape cultural awareness about Sikhs through celebrating the community's contributions. And school boards even get to decide how, when, and what is being taught to our children about Sikhi. So state policymakers can decide what laws protect our community from bullying, hate crimes, and workplace discrimination. And federal government officials can decide who gets to immigrate into the United States, for example, and what other additional laws can promote safety. But another important part of why engaging our policymakers is critical here is for the representation aspect. The experiences of the Sikh community and those perspectives are often not known by our policymakers, and as a result, they don't know or aren't even aware of the issues that our community is facing. However, through our community members like you, we can change that by sharing our stories about our experiences of either being harassed by law enforcement because of how we look, or experience of hate crimes or bullying in schools because of our faith, our nationality, our accents, or culture, and the like. And getting engaged reduces misconceptions and stereotypes about Sikhs. More opportunities for positive associations are created when the community sees more Sikhs in their daily lives. And as a result, they learn more about Sikhs and they shed false information. There's a psychological phenomenon by which people tend to develop a preference for things merely because they're familiar with them. And it's because of that familiarity principle, it demonstrates that the more someone sees a person, the more pleasing and likable they find that person. And that, as a result, improves the understandings between the community and Sikhs as having positive associations between social groups and within the community. But more importantly, it creates inclusive policies. The more we operate in spaces with policymakers, the more we can become comfortable sharing our stories more frequently to highlight what issues we face and what action needs to be taken. So this also then creates a welcoming space for Sikhs. As policymakers understand more positive associations with Sikhs and our challenges, they can use their positions of power to invite Sikhs to participate in more public-facing settings. And this can then help raise broader community awareness, and it creates opportunities for new connections for our community. And those welcoming spaces may even lead to celebration and recognition of the impact of Sikhs in the community. But that participation really leads to one critical factor, which is decision-making for the community. What we will do is that representation will give us greater access to social, economic, cultural, and political power for our community. Our government policymakers have far-reaching powers that can shape all of the areas of American life. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to chat them. We'll definitely address them as they come up, or you can raise your hand. There's a little button on that within Zoom, and we'll be able to unmute your audio accordingly. But here's another poll for everyone. How effective do you think is community mobilization? That could include petitions. A lot of you have done those. Some of those are phone calls. Some of those are emails to officials. So if you had to guess how effective they are, what would you say? Well, it looks like mostly everyone has voted here. We have 2 people who said it's extremely effective, And we had 5 people say it's somewhat effective, and then 2 people who also said it depends. Maybe I'd like to ask a question of why do some of you think that it is somewhat effective, or maybe why does it depend? And we'll be happy to unmute the audio to see who would like to share their perspective with the class. I think you can hit the raise hand feature at the bottom if you'd like to speak. Okay.
Sim, I'm happy to share, maybe to get people a little bit warmed up to the idea of speaking. So I think oftentimes when I talk to community members, they say somewhat, it depends, or just like are not necessarily moved because they don't think one voice is going to really make a difference. Or that people, policymakers, are even looking at emails or picking up the phone. So maybe you can expand a little bit on whether or not they do that.
Definitely, they really care about all the petitions, all the phone calls, all the emails. They log how many people have called and what their positions are. And that in turn will inform the policymakers as to what they need to do and how many people are really carefully watching what is happening and what they want to see change as a result of that. And we'll talk throughout this presentation as to there's several factors as to when community mobilization can be effective and sometimes when it's not effective. And we'll learn that timing is an important element, as is framing who you are making that ask to.
Yeah, and perhaps Sukhbir had a question because she was trying to figure out how to raise the hand function. So Sukhbir, I'm going to unmute you really quickly.
Yeah, so it was just a reflection, really. I think that, so I'm one of the participants who voted it depends. And I'm saying that because I think in most cases, protest movements, community organising, things like that are really, really good for raising awareness. But unfortunately, sometimes it doesn't, the effect doesn't really go beyond that. So the awareness is raised, but it doesn't, sometimes off the back of that, there's no real tangible actions that are implemented as a result. But I guess that's just one of those things that it gets to a point where it's out of the community's control in terms of, yeah, they've gone out there, they've put their point across, and then kind of the ball is in the decision makers' court as to whether they're going to act on that pressure that's been put on them or on the issue that's been raised. So that's why I said it depends, because sometimes, yeah, you can protest outside Parliament or outside a Member of Parliament's office, but they may acknowledge you're there, but not, yeah, they see you're there, but they still don't want to engage with you. So it really does depend. It depends on who you're trying to reach, really, and what their reaction is, and kind of if they warm to the cause, which unfortunately they don't always warm to the cause. So yeah.
You've hit a lot of critical elements there, Sukhbir. So thank you for sharing why you voted it depends. And I'm really glad to hear that everyone is critical in terms of deciding, how effective certain mobilization campaigns are. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we can get there. And just as a side note, I know you mentioned a lot of focus on Parliament, and this presentation is going to focus a lot on the US legal systems of power. And so that's not to be exclusionary, but that's primarily because of some of the work that we do, which focuses on domestic policy. But I'm sure that can easily translate to systems of parliament out in Canada and the UK as well. So I actually wanted to start this conversation by sharing some of the community mobilization initiatives that the Sikh Coalition has let out on to show when it is done right, it can be really powerful. And in fact, we helped pass a California Workplace Religious Freedom Act. And with this California Workplace Religious Freedom Act, what it did is it closed a loophole in federal law that allowed employers to easily discriminate against religious headwear and segregate those with religious headwear in the workplace. So putting people in back rooms and not letting them have public-facing positions. While it is a federal law, the states do have a say and they can fix that loophole at the state level. And this conversation started with relationships that the Sikh community had already existing with some state legislators in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. These conversations started and they eventually led to surface other important problems that the Sikh community was facing. And as such, the Sikh Coalition helped mobilize community members throughout California. And we had the state legislature basically over the course of 6 months, which is astonishingly fast for any state legislation, put in place a workplace religious freedom law. And that resulted through public testimony where we had hundreds of Sikhs show up to speak about workplace discrimination that they had experienced. And we also had interfaith partners and allies come out and share their stories as well. And that overwhelming number of support, that physical attendance, along with petitions that resulted, is what helped expedite this and lead to the governor signing this bill into law. But then we also have other incidents which are a little bit more reactive. In the Bergen County case, for example, in 2019 of last year, that was October, the sheriff of Bergen County made some racist statements claiming that New Jersey Attorney General Gurbir Grewal was only appointed to his position because of his turban. And this was an audio recording that surfaced online. It also captured other biased remarks against the African American community and the LGBTQ community. And as a result, the Sikh Coalition didn't lead on the charge, but we helped mobilize a lot of other community members because there was so much outrage, but it was important that the Sikh voice be there as well. And so that resulted in thousands of emails being sent to county officials demanding that the sheriff be terminated or resign from his position. And he is an elected official. And as a result of that petition and everyone else's outrage on this issue, the sheriff issued an apology and also issued his resignation. And as over the course of the year after that, the Sikh Coalition continued to work with the New Jersey Bergen County Sheriff's Office to conduct Sikh awareness presentations for all of those law enforcement officers so that they can better understand the Sikh community and hopefully not view them in a racist and problematic manner. But you'll see, we've got a little map on the bottom right, which shows you how many people have taken action. We had about 1,700 emails sent to the county officials here. And that was smart targeting of the right people who are in charge of putting pressure onto the sheriff for them to do the right thing here. And then here's one other example. In the Michigan state curriculum standards, these are mandated on what students will learn. And we help change the educational standards to include Sikhism in public school lessons all throughout the state of Michigan. But what that took at the local level is over 400 community members who wrote to the State Department of Education. And we also had 12 Gurdwaras submit a letter to the Department of Education as well, urging and stressing on the importance of why we need to be teaching Sikhism in our public schools. And that takes a lot of personal relationships and that takes pressure. You'll see on the chat box on the left, we had some very detailed insight into how the Department of Education election officials would be voting on the issue and what mobilization initiatives would be needed by the community to help cross that hurdle. And the end result was that Sikhism was going to be included in the state's curriculum standards. But none of this would have been possible without community advocates who were working to target very smartly the appropriate agency to bring that change. I think what's important here is that we targeted the State Department of Education. We could have just broadly made a complaint to the governor of Michigan, but that wouldn't have been as effective here. And it's that kind of approach that I think many of you have identified. This is why it depends on why certain mobilization campaigns really are impactful or not. And before we go on, does anyone have any questions or want to share any insights into the Michigan State Curriculum Standards campaign, what's been going on in California or Bergen County, or have any other general questions that we want to address before we move on to the next section, which is understanding our government and the power structures within? You can raise your hands on this. I think we've got a small enough group where that's going to be conducive here for people to share their voice. I think we have a shy group.
And again, the raise a hand function is at the very bottom of your screen. So you can hit the raise a hand, or if you're having trouble finding it, just chat that you'd like to ask a question.
Okay. Well, if there are questions that come up, we'll definitely stop and address those. So please feel free to ask them as needed. So when we are talking about that targeting of our elected officials, our policymakers to bring in an effective change, we have to, I think, understand a little bit about how the government works and what those layers are within that government to smartly bring about that change. So how you go about bringing that change will depend on the issues that you care about the most. And so as a result, we're going to share what the power structure system looks like here in the United States. At the very top, there's usually federal issues, and those are usually matters that are happening nationwide or internationally. This can include what's happening to Afghan Sikhs. This can include hate crime statistics reporting or federal laws prohibiting discrimination. Then the next highest power within our government systems is at the state level. And here's where you can start addressing some issues as to what is being taught in your schools, for example, or state laws that might address hate crime legislation, or even declare and celebrate Sikh Awareness and Appreciation Month. But oftentimes there's an overlap at the state and federal level, such as training on law enforcement on hate crimes or dealing with employment discrimination laws. And so that can sometimes be a murky area to understand who to target in terms of what you want to engage with your policymakers. But most of the time, your community concerns are going to start off as a local matter, and that's at the municipal level. And that will include your local school boards sometimes, that will include your cities, that will include your county officials. And oftentimes, some of the issues that will come up are children being bullied in schools, a Gurdwara not getting a rezoning permit, someone that is being attacked for hate crime, or experiencing some other incident. And usually if the local government is not responsive, it can then rise to the attention of state officials and then go federal if you're not getting the appropriate responses. So usually you want to work your way up from the bottom if you aren't getting the results. But at each one of those levels, when we're talking at the federal level, at the state level, and at the municipal and local level, we have to understand the lawmaking process as well, because these are the structures in which you're going to effectuate the change. And so once you've narrowed down the appropriate government level that you want to start working with, we need to then decide what branch of the government needs to receive your attention. If you want to introduce new law, overturn old law, or fix a loophole, you'd ordinarily go through the legislature, as they have the power to introduce new legislative proposals or even provide funding for initiatives. If you want someone to not sign a bill into law or have an issue with a government agency, the rules that they're making or maybe not making, then you want to narrow your focus within the executive branch. And oftentimes it's the president or the governor or the mayor. And however, you may have issues that might be a little bit more nuanced. So for example, imagine if you're a truck driver and you're being told by the Department of Transportation that you must remove your turban to wear a hard hat in order to drive your truck. Your grievance might be best targeted towards that agency, which is the Department of Transportation, instead of the actual executive, which could in this case be at the state level, your governor, or at the federal level, because there's also a federal DOT, which would be President Trump in this current time and period. There's also the judicial branch. That requires a more sophisticated kind of advocate, usually a lawyer to challenge existing law or obtain some kind of corrective action. And this is not the civic engagement route we're going to discuss in this program, but it is a powerful tool, and that one that won't take up much time in order to make sure that we stay focused on how we can bring change through the legislative and the executive side. I know I've given quite a bit of information on that. Does anyone have any questions about either the federal, state, municipal levels, and then the lawmaking structures at the legislative or the executive branches? Feel free to chat them. Feel free to use the raise hand button if you want to share your question in real time. We are always here to clarify or provide additional information. I see that we have a question about, would we be able to speak about them in the Canadian structural context? Unfortunately, being a US resident and US lawyer, I only know the US lawmaking and power structure systems. And as the organization, we focus primarily on domestic issues here in the United States. So we won't be able to share that. However, I would point you to contact the World Sikh Organization, and they would be able to potentially share some of those additional details and contexts for what is applicable in to our neighbors in the north.
If I could just add on that point, I think the concepts of not necessarily what we call our branches as far as legislative, executive, or judicial, but Sim had said this earlier, and I want to reiterate this, that these can be very much translated as far as practices go, as emails, calling, meeting with those in power, policymakers, whether you call them MPs or Congress members here. It is very, very similar, and understanding committees, who sits on what decision-making body, as long as you explore, understand all of that, you know where you want to apply pressure. So again, legislative, executive, judicial may not entirely make sense as far as what we're calling these bodies and these structures, but the ideas of building relationships and putting pressure on relationships, the idea of making asks before you vote or before you donate, are all exactly the same, even in Canada and the UK. It's just a matter of having different sets of names.
Yeah,
so I just wanted to underscore the point that you had made earlier.
Right. I think your equivalent for Parliament would be your legislative branch. But yeah, there's a lot of overlap and corollaries there.
Okay, Sim, we have one question. I'm just going to unmute.
Yeah, I'm backtracking a bit here, but I just thought, out of interest, on the previous couple of slides where you talked about getting Sikhism introduced into the school curriculum, just out of interest, do you know how many votes there were for and how many votes there were against in getting that passed? Just out of interest, just so I just wondered, like, did it go through like with quite a big majority, or was there quite a lot of opposition? I just thought that would be interesting to know if you have that information.
Should you, do you want to share a little bit more? I don't remember the exact vote breakdown for that one, but you know, I think at the end of the day, we did secure the successful amount of votes necessary under the rules to get that change effectuated. And once it's done, it's pretty hard to undo that because then you would need to do further curriculum standards reviews and votes to undo the inclusion of Sikhism into the Michigan state curriculum standards.
Yeah, very quickly, Sim, I'm happy to add. In Michigan in particular, it was only a couple of votes that were in opposition. And just to be clear, when we talk about being in opposition, sometimes it's specific to the Sikh entry, and sometimes it's actually about the entire standard. So it's not specific to what the Sikh community is asking for, but that board member or those board members may not actually be in favor of the entire overhaul of the standard. And generally that's because it's moving in a more inclusive approach to education. And there are a lot of push and pull in the United States, state by state, as to being either more conservative or being more focused on, let's say, founding fathers and not talking about like immigrant experiences. And so sometimes the opposition is actually not specific to the Sikh community. It's about the standards as a whole. And that's usually what the standards are getting voted on. So in Michigan, if I remember correctly, and please don't quote me on this because I'd have to look at my notes, I actually think it was only a couple of board members. So not a large number, but it was 2 or 3 that voted in opposition of the standards to be updated. And whereas we have been in very close calls, so in Arizona, we actually won by only 1 board vote. And again, in that case, it wasn't specific to the Sikh community, though the Sikh community probably had the largest turnout and mobilization to overhaul the state standards as a whole, because they were actually working to regress the standards to a very, like, just Abrahamic faiths altogether at one point. And there it was actually only 1 vote that we won to actually instate the new standards, whereas if we had not won that set, it would have set there, it specifically would have been, they would have gone through either another round of edits or voted to bring in potentially a 3rd option for standards that were even more conservative. So it really all depends.
Okay, yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Sorry, Sim, go ahead.
No, these are great questions. I'm glad we're getting some thoughtful dialogue going. And now that you've learned a little bit about some of the structures at the federal, at state, at the local level, I wanted to share some case studies that kind of reiterate as to what the Sikh Coalition has done and how we work within those power structures. So if we're talking about who we want to influence, this Afghan Sikh targeting campaign that we've had going on after the March 25th bombing, where 25 Afghan Sikhs were, murdered because of a gunman affiliated with ISIS. We worked to ask Republican and Democratic offices here in the United States to help bring refugee status to those Afghan Sikhs so that they can come to the United States and lead a better, more dignified life. We needed bipartisan support, and as a result, we had to target Republican offices to get that going. And we worked with communities in those states, and within 48 hours, because of that targeted pressure, we were able to make that letter bipartisan. And this happened on the Senate side, and we knew that we needed to make this bipartisan because on the House, members of Congress, it was overwhelmingly Democratic. We didn't have a single Republican member support the plight of Afghan Sikhs in order to get them resettled here as refugees. But as a result, we were able to change that narrative. We were also able to get social media statements put out by our elected officials in the US House and Senate. And that also drove up more media coverage. And we also had President Biden, or campaign President-elect Biden, make a statement as well that Afghan Sikhs needed to be resettled. And I think that kind of targeting is really essential. And we focus this all at the federal level, because at the federal level, they have the power to influence immigration policy, admissions policies, and even provide direct assistance in Afghanistan. And so we wanted to target the State Department, and we did have contact with the State Department, but they were a little bit reluctant. So the next step was to work with our members of Congress to pressure the State Department to make this happen. A lot of work still needs to be done on this front. We just earlier did today a panel on the plight of Afghan Sikhs and Hindus. But this is a continuing advocacy initiative that we're working on at the federal level in order to effectuate that change. It would not be a smart use of our time to bring this advocacy campaign to, let's say, the governors of the 50 states, for example. So we're very targeted, and it's the timing as well. We brought this petition very rapidly, and so it was still in the minds of legislators, it was still in the minds of the press, and so we're able to get that traction going. Here's actually a really recent case study that literally just happened over the course of the past 3 months as well. A man entered Laquan Singh uncle's store, told him and his wife to go back to your country. Laquan's uncle went out to take a picture of the individual and was rammed with the vehicle of that man. And the individual was later arrested, and he described Laquan's uncle as an older Arab to law enforcement. Unfortunately, in the days following, the prosecutor's office stated that there would be no bias charges because the statement, "go back to your country," was too common to be indicative of bias. We did not accept that position, and that was something that needed to have our community mobilize in order to pressure the prosecutor's office to bring hate crime charges. So as a result, thousands of emails from advocates were put out into the DA's office, as well as local elected officials. We've also had sign-on letters from 29 different other organizations. There was a lot of media coverage, and there were statements that were put out from elected officials as well. But thankfully, after 3 months of sustained community pressure, the district attorney finally brought hate crime charges, and this just happened this week. So this goes to show you at the local level how we're targeting here. We weren't targeting the Colorado's governor here for action. We were very localized in asking for the local prosecutor to bring hate crime charges. And it's additional resources, but it's really advocating that kind of change here that's critical here. And what we have to also keep in mind is who we elect as a community matters in these situations. Again, the Sikh Coalition is a 501c3. We can't tell you how to vote, but the district attorney and attorney general are elected positions in the state of Colorado, as they are in many other states. So it's critical for us to hold our elected officials accountable. We can't have them saying that there is no bias when clearly someone says, "go back to your country," and then commits a crime is the very act of a bias crime here. So bringing people into Gurdwaras and having photo opportunities is not going to be good enough for a community. We have to make our asks, and we have to hold our elected officials accountable if we're inviting them into our spaces, if we're donating, and if we're voting for them. These are important things that will make sure that we don't have to mobilize for 3 months and bring thousands and thousands of petitions to just secure legal justice for what is really an apparent hate crime for Laquan Singh and many other Sikhs that may have some issues later down the road. We also had community members reach out to political offices like governors, and we've also just kind of put pressure on political relationships as well. The DA was up for election this season, and the opponent there seized on this narrative and made sure to use this public-facing issue as part of their campaign as to ensuring and communicating to the Sikh community as to the importance of protecting the Sikh community. So I've got another Zoom poll here for everyone. I have a question for everyone. What is the biggest barrier for you becoming more engaged with your policymakers? We've seen how petitions can effectively leverage and bring change, but what if you were to engage on your own? Are there things that you feel would limit you to start engaging with your policymakers? And this is multiple choice. You don't have to just pick one answer. We'll give everyone another 15 seconds or so to submit their votes. Okay, it looks like mostly everyone has provided their answers. So it looks like overwhelmingly, the biggest barrier for everyone here is that they don't know where to start or who to talk to. And yeah, it looks like the other biggest issue is you believe you need more influence, and that's an important issue that we'll address as well. No personal time to decide. Unfortunately, I don't think we can help with the time allocation. That's an age-old question for everyone. And there's others they're just afraid of saying something that might be wrong or incorrect. But okay, these are some great answers. And I'm just checking the questions here. Okay. And you're actually right, Sukriti, there is a big barrier of a lack of information about organizations that represent the community and political standing there. So I think in the majority of these barriers that everyone has experienced, the Sikh Coalition can help with some of them, and we're here as a resource for you. And so we would like to make sure that you feel a little bit more comfortable, at least in how you approach your elected officials and policymakers. So here's another question for you. When do you think is the right time to engage with policymakers? As everyone is just providing their answers, I'm just looking at Kunwal's question. Yes, this is focused on our advocacy with policymakers. And so that a lot of that is with dealing with the legislature, elected officials, and for the advocacy that we can be doing to stand with community organizations, there is a whole host of things that we can be doing to stand shoulder to shoulder in demonstrations. We can be signing some of their petitions as well as they try to effectively work to change the minds of policymakers. There's also ways that you can help contribute to any of their fundraisers. There is so much that we can be doing as a community to bring forth advocacy just beyond our community. You can get involved with interfaith coalitions. You can even join local councils. And if you need any other ideas about how to get involved with any specific community concerns, definitely feel free to email us and we'd be happy to guide you through some of that. And looking at the poll results, so the question again was, when do you think is the right time to engage policymakers? It looks like it's split around election season and then immediately after the issue arises. And that's an interesting breakdown for most of the class here. Based on some of the case studies that we've just mentioned before, whenever there's an incident that happens, such as a crime or an act of violence, then we know that the immediacy is important. Time needs to be a critical factor in moving and mobilizing. But there are other situations, such as maybe asking the mayor to issue a Sikh Awareness and Appreciation Proclamation, that may not require as much urgency, but might be time critical, as offices need about 2 months or so to prepare and put things together. In other situations, we'll have to wait there until there's enough community members expressing that there is a problem and that this is a widespread issue, such as employment discrimination, as we saw in our California model earlier. And we have to gain that critical mass to ask for the law to change, to stop that discrimination from multiple community members. Election season can also be an opportunity for us to remember how our elected officials voted or acted in the time of our need. And if they didn't meet the expectations, then they need to promise to make sure that this issue won't happen again, or we need to make sure that we're asking the opposing candidates to commit to addressing the issue of importance before they get our votes or our donations moving forward. So I think a lot of you have definitely identified the right timing for certain engagement with policymakers. But again, it all depends. Depends on the issues that you care about and the immediacy of that. So anyone have any other questions or observations about how you get involved with certain advocacy initiatives? Again, you can raise your hand by clicking on the raise hand function, or you can chat them down. But I'd be happy to answer any of those and take a moment to pause to see if any of the other questions or polls elicited any other responses for everyone. Okay. So not all situations require us to have an in-person meeting. And I want to say that because in our COVID-19 environment, we've all had to adjust our approaches. Thankfully, there are phone calls, Zoom meetings, emails, and letters are all still options, and they do pay attention to them. But remember, they only pay attention to them if they have the power to do something about those phone calls or emails. So if you're sending those phone calls and emails and letters to the right officials, it can play an important role. Sometimes we also have to think outside of the box. If we're really upset about an issue, we may not want to protest on the street or in a building with social distancing guidelines. Maybe we have to consider alternatives like a car protest to keep everyone safe from the virus exposure. At a basic level, it's important for us to understand how we approach our policymakers. And we always want to try to come at this from a place of being at the table, having constructive dialogue with our policymakers, not jumping immediately to the protest march. So there is a give and take to all of this, and there's a dynamic that we need to keep in mind. There's a relationship model that works just like it would in real life with our friends, with our families, with business colleagues. There's a proactive model and there's a reactive model. And we often will fall into one of these two camps as a community. Sometimes we'll be in the reactive model, where we don't know who our elected officials are, who are in charge of the issue. We only get in touch with them to complain or when it's really, really needed. And so that puts us in a very reactive spot. However, there are some proactive community members out there. They're engaging on multiple issues and they're building a relationship with their policymakers, and they can get in touch immediately if something urgent arises. Most of us want to live in this reactive space because we only have limited resources. We can only care about certain things, but it's not that relationship that will get us more of what we need. That's only going to provide us temporary makeshift solutions. So we have to find a way to become more proactive. So we have to spend time identifying our contacts, identifying which policymakers and what their capabilities are. You may not know what the city's police force, you often may not know that your city's police force doesn't oversee your Gurdwara. Sometimes it's the county sheriff or the county police department that is the responsible agency. And knowing that bit of information will help you better understand who you need to turn to if there is a situation that arises. Because if you go to local city police and you ask them for help, they may not be able to help you. And that leaves you putting together ineffective solutions. And those ineffective solutions are put together oftentimes because our policymakers don't understand their community or what their needs are. And as a result, the solutions that they put together are just going to be temporary. They don't really address the underlying issues, almost like putting a Band-Aid on the problem. And so if we want to try to get a bigger fix, actually address the root of the issue, we have to be more proactive in our approaches. So no matter what your approach is, there's a certain level of communication that's going to be required whenever you go into meetings. No matter the relationship model, if you're a proactive person or if you're reactive with your communication, there's some basic things that you need to be aware of before you engage with your policymakers. Obviously, if you are in the reactive camp, you're going to have less time to better learn about the issue and the policymaker. At a high level, it's 3 steps. First, we got to identify the issue that you care about and who's going to address your issue and what power they have to act. Secondly, if you look at the flow, we're going to have to develop an ask. We have to think through what the policymaker needs to do about the issue. And then lastly, that's when we want to contact the office to share our issue and make the ask of the individual. So I've got some models here for you. Let's say you want to bring up the issue of schools not teaching Sikhi. The Sikh Coalition has resources that you can help discuss the matter with your policymaker. Usually it's your local school board or state board of education. You can ask other parents and students what they are learning about world religions to learn if you need to include Sikhi in the curricula. And you should also ask how much time are those other religions getting in their lesson plans? Is it 1 paragraph or is it a whole class period? At what grade level is it being taught and under what course? These are all important facts that you should learn to fully understand the issue to help craft an appropriate ask. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But what you're going to learn about the issue prior to meeting is you want to learn what level of government has jurisdiction. Remember, we spoke about the federal, state, and the local levels. Which public body has the decision-making power? Is it the legislature? Is it the executive? Is it an agency within the executive? Is it the mayor? Is it the city council? Who are those key decision makers? For example, there's committees often. The Department of Education is run by many, many people. There's usually 12 or 6 appointed individuals. You need to know who's running that. Are there caucus leaders? Are there maybe even political party leadership that you need to be reaching out to? And then when is the issue or legislation coming up for potentially a hearing or vote? This is also important for you to know in terms of learning about your issue. And you should also try to understand who is lobbying in support of the issue and who's lobbying against the issue. As Sajid had mentioned about Michigan, it's not that the voters were against the inclusion of Sikhi. Sometimes it was just that they were against putting in any material that taught about religion in schools in a constitutionally sound manner. And so understanding those messages, understanding their arguments, will also help you in framing your ask to the elected officials or the policymakers. But I actually have a question for everyone here. And I think this would be a great one for everyone to raise their hands and share a little bit more. Why do you think we need to learn about the policymaker themselves? Feel free to chat it in or raise your hand on the bottom right button. Would love to hear why you think it's important to learn about your policymaker. And when I'm talking about learn about your policymaker, you know, that's, let's just say you want to learn a little bit about your school board elected official. Why do you need to know about them?
Folks are super quiet. um, Sim, I think that it would be also interesting to hear from people. Oh, so just Reith just said helps you know how to influence their decision.
Yeah, you definitely want to know how persuadable they are to the issue, right? Knowing what party affiliation they have will help you understand sometimes how they will vote, not every time. It'll help you understand what they care about, right? If you understand that they care about including more world history, including more things about diversity, they're more likely to be open to the idea of wanting to include Sikhism into their curricula standard. So that'll also inform how much effort you need to put into persuading that individual. Or you may even know that maybe they're not the right person to spend your time with, right? Because we all have a limited resource, and that is our time and energy. Sometimes we then need to identify other people within government or opposing parties or different political viewpoints who might be easier to work with and they can actually deliver better results. So you just want to know what motivates them, and you want to know that so that you can help build a relationship just as you would with anyone else. And
Yeah.
Kunwal has said you can share your values and align and educate them and where they diverge. And Sajit, you wanted to say something else?
No, I was going to actually add a couple of other responses that folks have said. One should know what their stance is and how open they are. If they aren't open, we should look at other people. And I actually think that's a really good point. Just to share a quick backstory for folks, when we were advocating for Sikhi to be included in Texas state standards, the School Board of Education, we actually did a deep dive in all of their previous voting history to understand exactly where on the spectrum different board members would potentially vote for Sikhi. Are they more inclusive? Do they have a soft spot, or are they thoughtful about immigrant communities? And so we looked at how they voted in science standards and in other language arts standards about like different examples that they were willing to include and not willing to include. And that gave us a very clear idea of who our potential allies were going to be, who are individuals that we would need to convince, and then what were ways we could convince them, power mapping. And then there were a couple of people that it just felt like it was not even worth the time or the effort to engage with, right? So we knew who are allies and who would make us a majority by converting them or getting them to be on our side. But there were a couple of people that it just wasn't worth the effort.
That's important, yeah. And you want to know who your policymaker is prior to meeting them, so that you can put in those resources in a smart way. You want to know whether the elected official generally supports or opposes your issue. Sometimes you have to look at related matters, such as their stances on linguistics, for example, or immigrant communities. You want to know what your lawmaker's voting record on the issue is. And so you can check sites like votesmart.org to understand how they voted on various issues. If you're meeting about a specific piece of legislation, you should also understand if your elected official is a co-sponsor of that legislation. What background information also would be helpful in crafting that ask. And so you want to consider maybe their party affiliation. You want to understand if the lawmakers may be a champion on certain related issues. You want to understand the demographics of your community. If it's a predominantly Asian community or a high percentage of Asian communities or Latino communities, it's very diverse. These are all factors that can play into whether they're going to be persuadable to some of the issues that are of concern to the Sikh community. And you also want to know if they're up for re-election, because that information, I think, is critical. So with that, I know we talked a little bit about how you better target some of the individuals and how you put together your resources and learn a little bit about the issues. But the most difficult part of advocacy is making the ask. And so once you've established who you're going to focus your civic engagement with, next is to determine what that ask is going to look like. You want to make an ask that's effective. So you need to make sure it falls into an achievable level. And so there's different levels of asks we can make of anyone that we interact with. The same principles in real life apply here with your regular relationships with ordinary people, friends, and family, as you would when you're engaging policymakers. So to help everyone understand what we're talking about here, I'm going to provide an example that I think we can all relate to. We all know someone who's asked to borrow money from us, right? So look, Balbir, if I would give you $100, would you give, I'm sorry, Balbir, would you give $100 to a person you've never met before? You can chat or function. I mean, I would probably guess you'd probably say no. Most people wouldn't want to lend $100 to a total stranger they know nothing about. And in the advocacy world, we would consider this a difficult ask because there's been no prior relationship, there's been no engagement. But look, if someone asked for $1, that ask is probably more easy, right? We classify that as a low-level ask, very minimal in terms of what is being requested, doesn't require a lot of trust, and it's a low level of commitment on our end. And our answers would probably change if someone asked us to borrow $100. If we knew that person for a long time and we trusted them, right? You'd probably give that $100 to your friend who was asking for it, to borrow it because maybe they left their wallet, whatever the reason may be. But it doesn't really, that would now fall into an easy ask, and that's because it falls into a different relationship model. You're not an unknown entity to that individual. Your ask may still remain easy, even if your friend is asking you for $1,000, if you're able to provide that kind of resource to them. And that just kind of demonstrates because there's a level of trust that's created by a strong relationship. And it's no different when you're making an ask to your policymakers. So when you're not going to be asking for money, that would be bad, probably illegal in most cases. But we're asking for action of some sort. And what we ask for will fall somewhere on the spectrum between an easy ask and a difficult ask. And so let's go back to the earlier example about teaching Sikh in public schools. Where do we think that ask would fall if all world religions, let's say we learn that all world religions being taught at your schools get one paragraph in the textbook and it's part of a 20-minute lesson plan. But our ask is we want a 60-minute lesson plan on Sikhism and Sikhs. Do we think that would be an easy ask, an intermediate ask, or a difficult ask? And I would love to hear what people here think that ask would fall into that category. You can either chat or raise your hand if you want to. I want to try to make this as engaging as possible. Surjit, yes, I think that would be a difficult ask. Absolutely, that is a difficult ask, right? And because we know the information at hand is difficult, right? You're asking for a lot more time and a dedicated lesson plan when it's not already part of a broader program. And so you're right, it falls into an intermediate and difficult range. If we changed our ask, if we asked for an equal treatment, for example, we want one paragraph in the book as well, and we want a brief lesson plan, so it falls within part of the bigger class, now it falls into an easy ask. So that is just an important example that will help you understand how you can make asks and frame them in a realistic manner to get more tangible results. May not be something that we're happy with. We all want to teach Sikh in the classroom for maybe 60 minutes, but that may not be tangible in every situation and circumstance. It's not only how you ask, it's also what you ask for that sets the difficulty level in your engagement. So this is all, again, part of trust building. If you're being responsive, if you're being honest, you have a proactive relationship, your ask difficulty also will shift in that relationship model. So I wanted to share a couple of next steps, and we'll also open it up towards the end for more Q&A so that you have all some additional time to discuss that. But here's some immediate actions everyone, I think, can take right now. You can check you and your family's voter registration. You can volunteer to get out to vote, and you can participate in our National Sikh Voter Registration Day. Follow your elected officials on social media at the local, state, and federal level, because that is how you're going to be fully informed as to what's going on and what issues they care about. Research your local boards. If you care about education, know who's on the school board. If you care about local municipal laws, know who's on your city council and see how you can get involved. And understand the importance of the census at my2020census.gov. I will note, however, with the census, there is a new executive order out where President Trump is looking to not count undocumented individuals in the census. We don't support this latest move by the administration, but we want to see a fair and accurate count of who is in the United States. And also, I just want to share how the Sikh Coalition can help you in any of your advocacy initiatives or engagement with the community. We get over 200 requests for our legal department alone, and we'll refer those incidents out where we don't have the expertise. We do this all for free. There's no charge. It's all done pro bono. We do this confidentially, and there's no pressure for anyone to get involved or have a public-facing campaign if that's what they are not comfortable with. We prioritize urgent and actionable requests and that they have a broad impact. So with that in mind, what we work on is we work in response to hate crime incidents, hate-related vandalism, school bullying, curb accommodations or arrests, employment discrimination issues, profiling, whether it happens at the airport or through police, or public discrimination accommodations. So if you're not allowed into restaurants or any other places of public venue. And then at the proactive level, if you want to get involved, you want more help on not saying the wrong thing, or you need to better understand the issue, or you want to talk through strategy or how to better engage your elected officials, look to get involved with your state hate crime task force, issue briefings on hate crimes, equal employment, bullying, and profiling to your elected officials and policymakers. Get involved with Get Out the Vote initiatives and the Sikh community's civil rights policy priorities, which you can share with your elected officials. We can also do Know Your Rights trainings, and we can also do Gurdwara security assessments, as we know that a lot of Gurdwaras might be concerned about the spike in hate crimes and attacks that might be happening against Gurdwaras. With that, I want to open it up to comments and questions so that if anything we are able to assist with or share additional resources, we would love to hear from you. There's the raise hand function button on the bottom right. Feel free to click that or chat in your questions. But we really appreciate everyone taking the time to learn a little bit more about how they can become better engaged with policymakers. And thank you again for taking the time to join us on this Saturday. We'll leave it open to questions. I'm also going to address a question that Kamal had raised earlier. How can one get law enforcement agencies to hire Sikhs in California? If there's a Sikh who wishes to serve, that's generally a first step. The California Workplace Religious Freedom Law, which is AB 1964 that we mentioned earlier, actually makes it difficult for any department to say no. And there are several Sikhs who serve in law enforcement departments across California now. So if they want to get involved, they can absolutely reach out to us or our legal team for additional information. Another question is, how do you handle differing opinions within our community? You know, we definitely have different opinions within our community, and I think it's great to have those different perspectives within the community, but building consensus is important. Sometimes we want to have a meeting with our other local community leaders to figure out what is the best path forward, and doing it in a democratic way where everyone is in agreement that the best interest for everyone is to do the following next things. Oftentimes we see differing opinions, and if there's action taken where people don't feel like they were consulted, if they don't feel like they were part of the movement, then that creates some challenges within community dynamics. Suchi, I don't know if you wanted to share more about differing opinions within our community as well.
Sim, I think you handled that question really well. I just to elaborate, you know, every Sikh community locally is also different, right? What their needs and what, so even though we are a larger month, a Sikh community in Queens, New York may be handling situations differently or have different needs than a Sikh community in Indianapolis, Indiana. And so just being mindful of, again, getting community buy-in, understanding the needs and being thoughtful about that. So definitely where possible, getting consensus and also educating one another about like why it is that we either make the statements that we do or think about the ways that we think about things. But I will say, at least at the Sikh Coalition, right, we also think about the values that we have as an organization that very much do come from the Sikhi spirit and Sikhi ethos and what we learned through Sikhi, and just grounding ourselves in that as well, right? So Sim made a statement that we are not happy with the executive order that came out to exclude undocumented immigrants and individuals in this country from the census. That is because we believe that everyone has the right to be counted, the right for their needs to be met. And we also have many people in our own community that are undocumented and have come to seek refuge in this country, right? And we have our own immigration stories here. So for us also, it is just very important to be mindful of, you know, where are our values and where do we draw those lines as well. So that's the only thing I'd add to that, Sim. Sim, I think just the last question that we should take, because we do have to switch to our next meeting. Are you seeing more or less or the same number of advocacy requests compared to 5 years ago? And I think maybe just expanding on this question, you know, as the Sikh community has grown in this country and has become more thoughtful in the way that we approach and larger actually in community power, like how has our advocacy ask been seen in the last 5 years as compared to maybe 10, 15 years ago?
You know, we're definitely seeing a lot more advocacy requests compared to 5, 10 years ago. We've got a rise in hate crimes affecting the Sikh community. And that's been over the past 4 or 5 years, where just in 2017 to 2018 alone, we've seen a 200% increase in hate crimes against the community. And this is what was reported by the FBI. We've gotten increased bullying reports that we've received through our legal team. We have seen a lot of activity at the federal level as well. There seems to be a lot of change as it relates to immigration policy that affects a lot of Sikh community members. There's a lot of need for language access at detention centers, for example, where we have members from India coming and not being provided religious accommodations in detention centers. They're not being provided meaningful translation services, oftentimes with individuals who might claim that they speak Punjabi, but clearly are nowhere near to being fluent and understandable for those individuals. And we've learned this because we have attorneys who represent for immigration matters throughout the nation. And they will hear the interpretations and notice that these individuals are not really speaking Punjabi. And so that's created a lot of challenges. As you've seen with the census, that's yet another ask. We have so much going on at the federal and state level that we have just been overwhelmed, as is every other advocacy organization under the current administration at the federal level, and also what's happening with the national discourse, where people just can't seem to agree, or we have a polarization of the community as it relates to the sentiments of white nationalists and inclusion and what it means to be an American here in the United States, or what people perceive. So thanks again for everyone for joining us. I'm glad we were able to answer some of those questions, and looking from some of the comments, it seems like this was of some help to people. And if we can be of further assistance and you have any questions or you are looking to get further engaged, we would be happy to share that information with you. We can advise accordingly. You can email us at advocacy@sikhcoalition.org. And we are always around as a resource. So feel free to reach out to us at any time.